The third phase of the Cold War is the period which began from the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis in late October 1962 till the end of détente in the late 1970s. The economic needs of the Third World states made them vulnerable to the foreign influences and pressures. Much needed resources for economic development came through economic ties and trade with the Western powers and the Soviet Union. The two rivals vied with each other to capture the political support of the newly independent countries. Some developing states devised the policy of non-alignment. The diplomatic policy of non-alignment regarded the Cold War as a tragic and frustrating component of international affairs. Non-alignment held that peaceful coexistence with its First World and Second World nations was both preferable and possible. The Vietnam War, which was another bone of contention between the two superpowers, was also witnessed in this phase. This phase also witnessed détente, which refers to the permanent relaxation of international tensions in the Cold War. The first sign of détente came in the early 1970s, stimulated by the horrors of Vietnam. Détente had both strategic and economic benefits for both sides of the Cold War. During the period of détente, the Sino-Russian relationships were not cordial, as China disapproved Khrushchev's policy of peaceful coexistence. Apart from the ideological argument, there was also a frontier dispute between Russia and China. The fourth phase of the Cold War is the period that witnessed deterioration in relations between the Soviet Union and the West arising from the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979. During December 1979, approximately 75,000 Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan in order to support the Marxist government formed by ex-Prime Minister Nur Mohammad Taraki, assassinated that September by one of his party rivals. The fifth phase of the Cold War is the period which began with the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev as leader of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary in 1985. The Soviet economy was stagnant and faced a sharp fall in foreign currency earnings. This prompted Gorbachev to investigate measures to revive the ailing state. In June 1987, Gorbachev announced an agenda of economic reform called Perestroika, or restructuring. This allowed private ownership of businesses and paved the way for foreign investment. These measures were intended to redirect the country's resources from costly Cold War military commitments to more productive areas in the civilian sector. Despite initial skepticism in the West, the new Soviet leader proved to be committed to reversing the Soviet Union's deteriorating economic condition instead of continuing the arms race with the West. Gorbachev simultaneously introduced glasnost, or openness, which increased freedom of the press and the transparency of state institutions. Glasnost was intended to reduce the corruption at the top of the Communist Party and moderate the abuse of power in the Central Committee. Glasnost also enabled increased contact between Soviet citizens and the Western world, particularly with the United States, contributing to the accelerating détente between the two nations. However, the USSR began to crumble as liberal reforms proved difficult to handle, and capitalist changes to the centralized economy were badly transitioned and caused major problems. After a series of revolutions in Soviet bloc states, the Soviet Union collapsed on December 31, 1991, breaking up into 15 separate nations. The fall of the communist Leviathan was preceded by the series of events in 1989, which marked the end of the Cold War. Some of the events were: Hungary decides to allow free elections and take down the fence between Hungary and Austria. Poland held its first free elections. Fall of the Berlin Wall. All these events, along with many more, led to the dramatic end of the Cold War.